we certainly advocate raw foods as the bulk volume of the diet. That is, raw fruits and vegetables make up the volume of the diet. But the idea that 100% raw food diet is the only way to go and be healthy, I would disagree with. The fact is that human beings have been using heat to process our foods for longer than we've been humans in this form, at least 500,000 years. And in fact, the use of heat to help us dextrinize starches and get access to calories has to a large extent been responsible for humans' ability to survive and thrive. And I don't see the use of heat to process vegetable materials as necessarily an undesirable consideration. Now, having said that, people that want to be raw food only for spiritual reasons, ethical, whatever their motivation is, the trick from my viewpoint is to get enough vegetable material in the diet. Mm-hmm. Now you might, instead of heating your vegetables, like for example, instead of steaming vegetables or steaming yams or potatoes or whatever, you want to blenderize it or juice it or whatever it is. That's fine. Now I'd point out that we have not been blenderizing and juicing foods for that long. That's a relatively recent event. There's also never been a culture that's of humans that have lived on exclusively raw foods. So I don't know that we can go natural argument to argue raw food only diets. It is also a little bit of an elitist recommendation because the cost per calorie in raw foods is about 10 times that of, say, cooked starches, which is why most of the 2 billion in the people in the world that don't live in industrialized countries, that don't have a lot of resources, live on things like rice and polenta and plantain and other types of starchy vegetables because their cost per calorie is lower because they're very efficient to produce. So I think there's some arguments that are made promoting raw food only diets that, although valid for encouraging the benefits of raw foods in the diet, and again I would argue that the bulk of the diet by volume should be, for most people, composed of raw fruits and vegetables. I think that the balance of calories can also very healthfully come from steamed starchy vegetables. And in fact, in some cases, people that are having trouble thriving on a very high sugar or high sugar, high fat diet, which is what most raw food diets end up being, may try continuing to eat large quantities of raw vegetable material. Again, whether it's whole salads, which is my preference, or if you want to blenderize or juice some of it, that's fine. Fruit within your tolerances, small amounts of nuts or seeds, and then make the bulk of those calories come from particularly vegetable-based materials, whether it's steamed collards and kale and broccoli, or potatoes and Hubbard winter squash, butternut squash, kabuchi, these types of starchier vegetables that are more efficiently processed when you introduce steam to help break down the starch. That balance of food, to more or less degree depending on the person, is actually what most of my patients ultimately thrive on. And for people that are maybe not getting quite enough calories from their raw food diet but don't want to go into the high sugar, high fat results of taking lots of dried fruits and God forbid you get into agave and some of this processed sugary stuff, which I'd actually argue vehemently against. Taking something like agave that's 80% fructose in quantity, I think, is a serious mistake and health compromising component. So again, there's lots of different ways to put whole natural foods together. More or less raw foods depending on the individual, their circumstances, their caloric needs. Clearly, when you get a person that needs 3,000, 3,500 calories because they're a competitive athlete, they're burning a lot of energy, it's very difficult to put a health compromising diet together that excludes the use of adequate amounts of vegetable material. So the real debate is not should you get a lot of vegetable material. The debate is how are you going to get it in. You're not going to just eat enough pounds of raw salad a day probably to meet your caloric needs. At 100 calories a pound, you need 20, 30 pounds a day of salad if that's all you were living on. That's not a practical solution for humans. So if, let's say, for example, you eat 2 pounds of fruit a day, just as a model, that's about 600 calories. And you have 2 pounds of salad a day, that's another couple hundred calories. That's about 800 calories. And let's say you have a couple hundred calories of raw nuts or seeds or what have you, that's about 1,000 calories. So now the question is, where do we get that other 1,000 calories? We could blenderize 1,000 calories, I guess, and juice vegetables. We could pour olive oil over everything and smear agave over everything and get the calories that way. We could eat a lot more nuts or coconuts and other high-fat foods, but that, as most people realize, has some problems. Or we can include starchy vegetables in the diet. So, and then the argument that, oh no, if you steam vegetables, that makes them a bad thing, that's where I would want to have the debate about whether that's actually real or not. And in fact, in my experience clinically, the patients that I see that have had trouble on raw food only diets often thrive by keeping the essence of the diet, but just including enough starchy vegetables that they meet their caloric needs. So, obviously there's a lot of room for debate and discussion here. But I think it's incumbent upon the people that are advocating don't use any heat to process any food, but it's okay to blend and juice and use all this very expensive processed isolated food is a good thing. I think it's up to them to kind of build the support for it and make the argument that, yeah, this is scientifically, experientially valid. To me, it doesn't hold water.